Whereas other bards thrilled their audiences with tales of Heracles' amazing strength and courage, Omeros sang about a man who had killed his own children in a fit of madness, losing his wife's love and destroying his reputation in a single night of mindless destruction. He sang, too, of the guilt that had driven him to seek absolution, only to be told by the gods that he must become a slave to his hated cousin Eurystheus, for whom he had to complete 10 impossible labours. In many ways, Heracles' life resonated with Odysseus' own, and the thought of hearing the final chapter of his story filled him with excitement and dread. He looked aside at Eperitus, who had served beside him through the long years of the war. He was laughing at something his wife was telling him, happy at last after all he had endured. Then the king turned his head to look at the woman seated beside himself, the woman he had won a war for and sailed 10 years to return to. Penelope was absorbed in conversation with Telemachus, their only son, oblivious to her husband's gaze. But as he looked at them, he counted himself blessed. For all his hardships, he had not suffered as Heracles had done. He had not lost his family. He reached out and laid his hand on hers. She turned and smiled at him, as beautiful as that day he had first set eyes on her. Seeing his expression, her brow furrowed with concern.
"What is it?"
"Nothing," he replied. "It's just—" Omeros drew his fingers across the strings of his lyre. At once, the conversation in the crowded halls stuttered to a halt and fell silent. The king squeezed his wife's hand and leaned back in his chair. "Sing, muse, of that mighty son of Zeus, illustrious Heracles, and of the remaining labours that stood between him and his freedom." The bard's voice was gentle and alluring, clear enough to be heard in the shadows at the back of the hall, and yet low enough to still every other sound, lest a single word of his song be lost. Odysseus felt himself drawn slowly forward on his chair as, with one gentle verse after another, the story of Heracles' quest to find release from his crimes unfolded before him. Again he shared the pain of a man who, like himself, had been forced to defeat monsters, outwit immortals, and ultimately face the fires of Hades before he could be whole again.
"Heracles stood before the battlements of Eurystheus' palace, awaiting his next labour," Omeros said. "What new monster had Hera sent to kill him? What impossible feat had she devised to destroy Zeus's bastard son? With what new torment would she seek revenge on her faithless husband? Such thoughts no longer troubled Heracles, not since the revelation that Copreus had induced the madness that had led him to murder his children. But Eurystheus' herald was no fool. He knew Heracles would kill him for the deaths of his sons, so he had kidnapped Megara, Heracles' estranged wife, and given her to the Amazons, instructing them to kill her if he should die. It was the only way to guarantee his safety from the wrath of Heracles. Or so he thought.
Chapter 1. The Ninth Labour. Heracles stood before the high battlements that separated the citadel of Tiryns from the palace of the king. The head of the Nemean lion sat atop his forehead like a helmet, casting its shadow over his stern features. Its tangled mane flowed to his shoulders, and its black hide hung down his back to his ankles, making him look even more massive than he already was. His broad chest rose and fell slowly, and his muscular arms hung still at his sides, the balled fists the only sign of the tension within. Birds were singing in the trees beyond the city walls, and the first light of dawn had crept into the heavens, forcing back the darkness and extinguishing all but the brightest stars. His escort fidgeted nervously as they waited for the arrival of Eurystheus and his advisers, and despite their numbers, 12 archers and twice as many spearmen, they had every reason to be uneasy.